This is Let's Read, Culture and Language as Social Determinants of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Health. Culture is a dynamic and adaptive system of meaning that is learned, shared, and transmitted from one generation to the next. It is reflected in the values, norms, practices, symbols, ways of life, and other social interactions of a given culture. It's the foundation of both individual and collective identity, and its erosion can adversely affect mental health and well-being, leading to depression, anxiety, substance use, and even suicide. Language is, quote, a conveyor of culture, end quote, and the means by which knowledge, skills, and cultural values are expressed and maintained. Language suppression, particularly for Indigenous peoples, is a, quote, form of disempowerment and oppression, end form, that impacts self-identity, well-being, self-esteem, and empowerment, all of which are key ingredients for individual and community healing. Language maintenance and continuity are critical to revitalizing culture and to the survival of any Indigenous people. For Aboriginal peoples in Canada who bear a disproportionate burden of illness, revitalization of culture and language is essential for improving health outcomes. This fact sheet provides an overview of culture and language as a social determinant of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis health. In doing so, it reviews disruptions to and current trends in language use and cultural practices by Aboriginal peoples in Canada. It will also highlight how culture and language can influence Indigenous perceptions and experiences of health and illness and impact the care they may receive in healthcare settings. Throughout this fact sheet, examples are provided of promising initiatives in revitalizing language and culture in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. It will also touch upon how culture and language can be integrated within clinical settings to improve health outcomes for Aboriginal peoples. Next section, colonization and Aboriginal culture, language, and health. Aboriginal people in Canada have experienced various forms of colonization, including the enactment of policies governing their lands and rights within Canadian society, the imposition of colonial educational and social institutions, and ongoing racism and discrimination. Collectively, these have contributed to disruptions in the social fabric of Aboriginal communities and a perpetuation of socioeconomic inequities and poor health outcomes among many Aboriginal peoples. While there are cultural and linguistic differences among Aboriginal peoples, as well as differences in their experiences with colonization, their socioeconomic status, and their general health, one of these experiences shared by all Aboriginal peoples as a result of colonization is an erosion of culture and languages. The Canadian government enacted a range of colonial policies designed to assimilate Aboriginal peoples, which involved cultural and linguistic suppression, forced relocation of communities, alienation from traditional territories and ways of life, and perhaps most devastatingly, the residential school system. The goal of residential school system was to assimilate First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples into European society through the separation of children from cultural influence of families and communities. The first of these schools was established as part of an early missionary activities, but they proliferated after the endorsement of 1879 Davin Report, peaking in 1931 with over 80 schools across Canada. The schools alienated children from their culture by forbidding them to speak their traditional languages or learn the skills they needed to thrive in their communities. The last residential school closed in 1996. However, the legacy of intergenerational health impacts is ongoing. For example, the schools can be linked to risk factors for poor overall health, including lower levels of education, chronic poverty, substance abuse, child and adult physical, emotional, sexual abuse, mental health problems, and family dysfunction. Aboriginal people continue to experience trauma, loss, and grief as a result of the rapid expansion of the child welfare system in the 1960s. During this period, commonly known as the 60s scoop, disproportionate numbers of Aboriginal children were placed into foster care. By the end of the 1960s, 30 to 40% of the children who were legal wards of the state were Aboriginal children, in stark contrast to the rate of 1% in 1959. Children continue to be apprehended at alarming rates under circumstances deemed to be, quote, child neglect, end quote, that are instead related to issues of poverty. Today, many children are placed in foster homes or adoptive care with non-Aboriginal families, severing ties to their families, cultures, and communities. This long history of separating children from their families and communities has undermined all aspects of well-being for Aboriginal peoples, including the structure, cohesion, and quality of family life, cultural identity, and self-esteem and sense of self-worth. This has contributed to elevated rates of suicide, alcoholism, violence, and pervasive demoralization in some Aboriginal communities. Next section. Culture and language maintenance within Aboriginal communities. Culture and language revitalization are sources for healing and resilience within individuals, families, communities, and nations. This section will draw on a limited number of indicators derived primarily from national survey data to enhance our understandings about the extent to which First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples continue to participate in cultural activities and maintain their language. Subsection Cultural Activities. Despite colonial policies aimed at assimilating Aboriginal peoples, an interest in participating in cultural activities continues to remain fairly high among First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. For example, amongst boys and girls 6 to 14 years old, 56% of Inuit, 43% of First Nations off reserve, and 33% of Métis took part in a cultural activity in 2006. Among First Nations youth aged 12 to 17, 74.2% participated in traditional cultural activities, quote, always, almost always, or sometimes for First Nations Information Governance Center. That's according to a First Nations Information Governance Center survey. The number of First Nations youth who view these activities to be important to them increased from 54.8 in 2002 to 85.7 in 2008. Just over 2/3 of First Nations adults on reserve and in northern communities reported participating in cultural activities sometimes. Different activities were reported by men and women. Amongst this age cohort of 18 to 29 years old, First Nations men had higher participation rates in fishing, hiking, canoeing, kayaking, hunting, or trapping, while First Nations women engaged in higher rates of dancing. Participation in cultural activities is especially high among Inuit. The 2012 Aboriginal People Survey indicated that 74% of Inuit, 81% of men, and 68% of women had hunted, fished, trapped, or gathered wild plants in the previous year, and that they did so for personal or family use, for pleasure, or to share with others in the community. The 2012 Aboriginal People Survey found that 51% of all Aboriginal adults had indicated an interest in doing the following activities: making clothing or footwear, making arts or crafts, hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering wild plants, while more Aboriginal women than men, so 57% versus 42%, expressed interest in participating in these traditional activities. More men than women, 65 to 60%, had done so in the previous year. Furthermore, 215,960, which is 61.3% of First Nations, and 1,093,330, which is 62% of Métis, and 28,970, which is 84% of Inuit, had engaged in some of these activities within the previous year. Language use. According to the 2011 Census of Population, there are over 60 Aboriginal languages used across Canada, which can be grouped to the following linguistic families: Algonquian, Inuit, Athabascan, Haida, Iroquoian, Kootenai, Salish, Siouan, Tlingit, Tsimshian, Wakashan, and Michif. Despite the linguistic diversity in Canada, most Aboriginal languages are in decline and some are even in danger of extinction. As of 2006, Inuit children under age of 6 had a high fluency of their mother language in some regions, 97% in Nunavik and 76% in Nunavut. In other regions, the rates were much lower, 12% outside of Inuit Nunangat and less than 5% in Nunatsiavut and the Inuvialuit region. Among First Nations children on reserve or living in northern communities, 49.7% are able to speak or understand an Aboriginal language. Of those, 11.6% could do so at an intermediate or fluent level, while 88.4% were at a basic level. The First Nations Regional Health Survey also found that more First Nations children spoke or understood an Aboriginal language if they lived in urban or larger communities. For Métis aged 15 to 19 years of age who reported the ability to use an Aboriginal language, less than 1/5 indicated that they spoke very well or relatively well. Overall, the 2011 National Household Survey reports that approximately 1 in 6 Aboriginal people are able to use an Aboriginal language in conversation. This translates to 240,815 Aboriginal people, or 17.2% of the population, a decline of 2% since 2006. While 63.7% of Inuit and 22.4% of First Nations and 2.5% of Métis are able to converse in an Aboriginal language, these percentages have all decreased since the 2006 census of population. Examination of the 2006 census data shows little variation between genders and the number of First Nations, Inuit, or Métis who spoke an Aboriginal language at home. Among First Nations, a higher percentage of those living on reserve had a stronger ability to converse in an Aboriginal language than those residing off reserve. Similarly, there are sharp regional differences in the ability of Inuit to speak their native language, with Nunavik 99%, Nunavut 90%, Nunasiavut 24.9%, Inuvialuit region is 20%, and outside Inuit Nunangat is 10%. Currently, Cree, Inuktitut, and Ojibwe have the greatest number of speakers, so 83,000, 34,000, and 19,000 respectively, and are considered the three most viable Aboriginal languages to survive in Canada. Task Force on Aboriginal Language and Culture, is where it came from. As well, despite the dire straits of many Aboriginal languages in Canada, there's a notable trend in Aboriginal people who have taken up learning an Aboriginal language. It's estimated that 23% of First Nations, 35% of Métis, and 10% of Inuit are currently learning an Aboriginal language as a second language. This uptake is one positive step toward language preservation and revitalization. Next section, improving outcomes. Researchers, linguists, and Aboriginal communities, educators, leaders, and agencies alike urge immediate action as a means of cultural survival, arguing that, quote, when our languages are threatened, the health and well-being of our people, a maintained connection to the land, and an ability to pass on and carry out traditional ways of life, maintain a worldview unlike any other is at stake, end quote. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada has also recently released 94 calls to action to, quote, redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of Canadian reconciliation, end quote. Of those, 5 spoke directly to culture and language, including government recognition of Aboriginal language rights, the enactment of an Aboriginal Languages Act, an appointment of an Aboriginal Languages Commissioner, the development of post-secondary degree and diploma programs in Aboriginal languages, and the reclamation of Indigenous family names. While the following section is not a comprehensive listing, it provides some First Nations, Inuit, and Métis-specific examples of initiatives to foster culture and language revitalization. It will also touch upon how the integration of language and culture within clinical settings can lead to improved health and outcomes for Indigenous peoples. The next section is called Fostering Culture and Language Revitalization. The early years are a special time for learning and absorbing language and culture from parents, families, and communities. Investment in early childhood development programs that incorporate culture and language is key to improving health outcomes. If Aboriginal children are to, quote, become well and healthy adults who meaningfully contribute to their communities and broader societies, in other words, if Aboriginal children are to become healthy citizens of their nations and the world, it is imperative that they are well versed in the fundamental values of their histories and cultures, end quote. Hornberger notes that children, quote, found their voice, end quote, and performed much better academically when Indigenous languages were employed as a medium of instruction in schools. Improved academic performance empowers Aboriginal children, provides them with more life choices, and benefits their social development. 2 examples which offer both culture and language programming include Aboriginal Head Start and Language Nests. Initiated in 2005, the Aboriginal Head Start program currently runs on reserve in northern communities and urban centers. The preschool program incorporates languages and culture and health promotion, nutrition, social support, and parental involvement for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children. These are key elements supporting education and school readiness for Aboriginal children. According to the 2008 to 2010 First Nations Regional Health Survey, children who had attended Aboriginal Head Start programs were, quote, more likely to speak or understand a First Nations language, end quote. Language Nests began in New Zealand as a means of immersing young children in their Maori language. A successful aspect of Language Nests is how they bridge generations. Language Nest learning involves preschool children learning from first language speakers in an environment where no English is spoken. Modeled after the success of New Zealand, language nests have been developed in several First Nations communities in British Columbia, including the Seiseten language nest at Adams Lake, conducted entirely in Secwepemc language, and the, quote, Raven's Nest program at Lilwat Nation, conducted in the Lilwat language. Culture and language programming is also vital for youth. Having a strong sense of identity, including cultural and linguistic pride, has been shown to positively influence mental health outcomes for Aboriginal youth. Opportunities to be exposed to traditional teachings through elders, learning cultural traditions, and language learning can restore resiliency amongst Aboriginal youth. The 3-week Kangid Luasuk student program is one model that exemplifies the potential of experiential learning combined with cultural and language development. taking place in the Torngat Mountain National Park, Nunasiavut, Labrador. The Kangid-Luasuk student program incorporates elements of leadership and experiential learning for youth, including outdoor learning, Inuit culture, and Arctic science. It is a transformative opportunity for Nunasiavut and Nunavik youth to explore and connect with their Inuit homeland and hear oral traditions and the experiences of their leaders and elders, and to build capacity building and leadership. Aboriginal cultures and languages are intimately connected to traditional lands and environments. Research indicates that the health of the land and the health of the community are synonymous, and that the relationships to the physical environment nurture the spiritual, economic, political, and social roots of culture. Participating in land-based activities can be a powerful facilitator for developing wellness and for increasing a sense of reliance and enhanced overall health. According to the 2008 to 2010 First Nations RHS, which is a survey, adults who took part in traditional language-based activities reported greater, quote, physical and spiritual balance, end quote, compared with those who did not. The RHS went on to note that the First Nations adults who use their language daily reported greater spiritual balance than those who do not. As well, those involved in cultural activities said they experience, quote, more control over their lives, more spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical balance, less substance use, and less depression, end quote. Given this, culture and land-based language immersion camps such as the Nehiyawak Land and Language Camp and the Ilisaksivik land-based program can be looked to as successful examples happening within communities. The Nehiyawak Land and Language Camp was spearheaded by Belinda Daniels, a second language learner of Cree. This week-long camp has taken place over the last 10 years along the wooded shores of Sturgeon Lake, Saskatchewan. It includes 15 adult participants and their families who camp, eat, and participate in activities as a collective group. The camp is run fully in the Cree languages and is combined with teachings, learning about plants and medicines, physical activity, and oral artistic traditions. Cree elders, teachers, and community members are brought in to provide specific knowledge and expertise in Cree traditions. Ilisaksivik is a nonprofit community-initiated and community-based Inuit organization located in Clyde River, Nunavut. Ilisaksivik offers multi-day land-based programming year-round to community members of all ages. The Summer Healing and Cultural Retreat promotes intergenerational healing. The Kimivut, our dogs, workshop introduces youth and young adults to land-based hunting and camping. The Men's Group and Father-Son program empowers and supports meaningful relationships among male youth, adult, and elders through organized hunting and fishing trips. And the Aranit, so Women's Retreat, provides an opportunity for women to reflect upon and support one another in their ever-changing social and environmental milieus. Though land-based learning is critical for well-being and environment in which culture and language is shared and learning is ever evolving. The digital landscape, for instance, cannot be underestimated as the emerging space and place for culture and language development for all ages and learning levels. Virtual learning and language preservation and promotion are found more and more through digital and social media, including DVDs, Facebook, YouTube, and mobile apps. The Louis Riel Institute has developed a DVD, manual, and online learning for Michif for all ages. First Voice is another example of a website providing a, quote, suite of web-based tools and services designed to support Aboriginal people engaged in language, archiving, language teaching, and cultural revitalization, end quote. The Aboriginal-run Ogoki Learning Systems, Inc. has created apps for languages including Satu, Cree, Yurok, Nuisuti, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Arikara. Online games, writing systems, videos, audio, and a number of free apps for iPod, iPad, and iPhones developed for children and adults are all available on this site. Culture affects perceptions about illness, including how patients express and manifest their symptoms, their style of coping, their family and community supports, and their willingness to seek treatment. Inuit perceptions of mental health, for example, focus on individual state at any particular time. A person may exhibit unusual behavior one day and be perfectly normal the next. Consequently, that individual may not be identified as mentally ill and in need of treatment. Likewise, the cultures of health practitioners and health service providers influence diagnosis, treatment, and service delivery. Cultural differences between patients and health service providers may lead to providers ignoring symptoms that are important to patients and patients not following through with prescribed treatments. As a result, patients may be at risk of not having their healthcare needs recognized and met. Strategies to improve health outcomes need to take place in clinical settings where a focus on reducing The cultural language differences between non-Aboriginal practitioners and Aboriginal clients is essential. Culturally appropriate healthcare can improve utilization of health services and ensure better treatment and outcomes. Elements of culturally appropriate healthcare include health professionals learning to communicate in the local language, practitioners combining local knowledge in health and healing with Western medicine, community development and control of healthcare systems to make services responsive to the local needs, applying Aboriginal concepts of health and wellness in healthcare policy and practice, and utilizing traditional healing practices. The Wabano Center for Aboriginal Health, located in Ottawa, is but one of many examples of a holistic healthcare provider offering a diversity of programming and services to meet the health and social needs of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people across the lifespan. In addition to clinical healthcare, the Wabano also offers specialized programs including housing, mental health, counseling, fitness, diabetes, and maternal and infant health programming, to name a few. A weekly cultural program incorporates traditional teachings from elders, drumming, singing, culture, art, ceremony, celebration, and language. Integrating Aboriginal culture and language into mental health interventions has been shown to be especially beneficial for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis who are healing from the historic traumas associated with the residential schools and other colonial policies. Some examples of such mental health interventions which have worked well in Aboriginal communities and for distinct populations are provided by Archibald. These interventions are based on the, quote, grassroots wisdom of community healing teams, end quote, and incorporate the cultures and traditions of the community and special needs of particular target groups. They embody principles of holistic health and are framed around the, quote, 3 pillars of healing, end quote, which are reclaiming history, cultural interventions, and therapeutic healing. Through providing education on the history and impacts of residential schools and Aboriginal peoples and communities, individuals are provided with a historical context for understanding personal issues, and through immersion in cultural activities and language, they're provided with positive, empowering experiences that work to both enhance personal healing and foster cultural pride and identity. Last section, summary. Culture and language have been and continue to be profoundly disrupted by colonial systems and structures. Many words, songs, practices, knowledges, and traditions have been lost or silenced along the way. This has burdened present generations of Aboriginal people with cultural confusion, shame in not being able to voice one's mother language, and poorer health outcomes. Because we know that cultural identity and practice are both protective and remedial, the urgency to revitalize and restore the well-being of culture and language is now more than ever a critical endeavor. This task will enlist the expertise and collaboration of many, including elders, speakers, knowledge keepers, leaders, linguists, teachers, educational institutes, nonprofits, healthcare providers, and government. It will take place in language nests in classrooms, around the kitchen table, and in environmental and digital landscapes. Ultimately, this concerted vision can ease intergenerational trauma, promote holistic healing, rebuild self-esteem, and restore cultural and linguistic pride. The end.